Okay, hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Megan Davies will defend the academic thesis titled Tri-National Ethnographic Multi-Case Study of Person-Centered Practices on Resident Quality of Life in Long-Term Care, Residential Care. We start this academic session with a 15 minutes summary of the main points of your thesis. So the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Dear committee, dear colleagues, dear family and friends, I would like to warmly welcome you to my PhD defence, titled Tri-National Ethnographic Multi-Case Study of Person-Centered Practices on Resident Quality of Life in Long-Term Residential Care, otherwise known as Triangle. In 2020, 25 million older adults in OECD countries were reported as living in long-term residential care. This was due to increased needs in daily care or care provisions, resulting from chronic illness, multimorbidity, acute illness, or a general deterioration in health or mental health. While it's generally preferred to stay in your own home as an older adult, increased need for daily support and challenges to informal care, such as changes in social trends or caregiver burden, as a couple of examples, make this more challenging. In addition, progressive diseases such as dementia, which is prevalent in up to 80% of long-term residential care home residents in Europe, make this increasingly challenging and increase the need for 24-hour support. The desire to stay at home, for even within deteriorating health, stems from generally negative connotations surrounding long-term residential care. This was highlighted ever more so during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the worst-case scenarios of long-term residential care were presented, especially in the media. Care homes became prisons, and residents were isolated and cut off from society, sometimes for unprecedented amount of times. And when you consider the amount of OECD country residents staying in long-term residential care during 2020, this is not an insignificant number of the population that were impacted. Within the care homes themselves, person-centered care, which is generally used now after a culture change in care provisions, reverted back to a less holistic model of care, reverting more to a medical model, even though person-centered care is intended to increase resident quality of life in care homes. Person-centered care aims to centralize the person in the middle of the care given. It has been undertaken in research for a number of years, but the gap between the rhetoric and the reality in long-term residential care remains, and this really needs to be understood more. Therefore, further empirical evidence is required. The intention of this is to improve resident quality of life and smoothen the transition into long-term residential care. Quality of life is also a complex and multidimensional concept within long-term residential care, and a general consensus has been challenging within long-term residential care and for older adults. Generally, the World Health Organization domains have been followed for quality of life. These are physical health, social relationships, psychological health, and the environment. However, in more recent research in 2022, additional domains have been developed, considering more the older adult themselves, particularly older adults within long-term residential care. And these are staff and resident relationships, autonomy and respect, a sense of community, food and drink, and activities. The reason I bring these to you in the background today is because these feature heavily throughout this thesis. The overall aim of this thesis was to explore resident experiences of person-centered care within long-term residential care in 3 European countries, and this was focusing on resident quality of life. In order to do this, we had the sub-aims of understanding the interrelating factors of person-centered care and quality of life, understanding resident experiences of COVID-19, particularly looking at residents who actually tested positive for COVID-19 in long-term residential care, looking at the overall mealtime experience and how person-centred care came into that in long-term residential care. Critically reflecting on rapid ethnography as a methodology to put resident voices at the forefront of healthcare research. And finally, exploring staff experiences of person-centred care and interprofessionality in long-term residential care. So to do this, we had to look at the context of each country, and we really had to understand the nuances of each, and we chose to do a tri-national rapid ethnography to do this. What this meant was we undertook observations with informal conversations, interviews, and document analysis across the 3 countries, which were Switzerland, the Netherlands, and the UK. We triangulated the data and also across country to contextualize the information and also fully understand what was happening in real time. Obviously, this PhD came also with a global pandemic, so we had to alter how we undertook the methodology as we went into long-term residential care to respect what was happening in each home. The timeframes changed. However, to adjust for this and to adjust for the differences amongst the team, we made sure that the core research group in research discussions remained the same. What was most important for us was the consistency of including voices in the research. This included resident voices, which we put at the forefront, staff voices, and also family members. The overview of all of the voices and the collective group of voices gave us really a good insight into what was happening in the long-term residential care homes, but for this thesis, as I've mentioned, we really put residents at the forefront. So as I mentioned earlier, there are overlapping features between person-centred care and quality of life to do with the concepts, and that came up in our background research, so I'd like to go into the results just by firstly explaining a little bit about this. We undertook a qualitative synthesis of information and meta-ethnography so that we could reinterpret and transform the analytical and theoretical information of concepts from the previous studies into our new information. And we came up with these, we developed the 3 themes that now run through the thesis, which is personalizing care within routines, optimizing resident environments, and giving residents a voice. So these are the themes that I will follow as I go through the results. So the most challenging part of person-centred care within long-term residential care was personalising care within prefixed routines. We had many opportunities observed during the course of the data collection. Some opportunities were taken and some were missed. In the UK, for example, in this second quote, even though in the same way as in the Dutch and the Swiss sites, meal times were permitted to be eaten in bedrooms as well as in the communal dining areas. This opportunity shows how badly it was missed due to low staff resources, and it didn't always function in the most optimal way. More able residents were actively encouraged to act more independently within the long-term care homes, and residents who were not able to do quite so much notably said that the reason for this and the reason for lack of person-centred care was a perceived lack of time on their part. During COVID, person-centred care became increasingly difficult. However, small changes made by staff to routines to make sure that the residents still had the best experience possible showed that person-centredness was possible even in the most extreme cases. Optimizing resident environments is, of course, also important for person-centred care. You can see here the 3 dining sites of the different care homes. The most similar in the physical setup are the Swiss and UK sites. However, the functioning of each were very, very different. In the Swiss and Dutch sites, residents had far more option to help themselves to food during the course of the day and act independently when they wanted to create their own meals. Whereas in the UK site, this was not altogether possible. Around the rest of the care home, the aesthetics also varied depending on the site, and it was interesting to see which of the different sites considered which options as homely. The Dutch site was the most extreme in differences and even included a room specifically for pets to be allowed on site permanently. So coming to the final theme of the presentation is giving residents a voice, which of course seems like the most obvious and most important in any case, in any care provision given. And all three sites prided themselves in offering choice to residents, and this was really part of what they thought was giving residents a voice. However, sometimes the choice wasn't great. In mealtimes, for example, where 2 options were given, plus special diet, it wasn't always what the residents had envisioned as what they wanted for themselves, as you can see by the first quote. In addition, with the pre-plated meals and no discussion with residents, the portion sizes were a hot topic of conversation during mealtimes. In the Dutch site, where residents were able to not only be involved in the pre-planning of meals, but also the preparation on the day of the meals, portion sizes were not discussed as much, and there was no complaint about the provision of food or choices on offer. It also encouraged different interactions between staff and residents, and also residents who, while preparing food, actually started discussing different things themselves. During COVID, resident voices were taken away further. Decisions were made without consulting and at times without even informing residents. And finally, as a researcher, I was very much reminded of how important the voice of the resident is when explaining my research to a resident in the UK who just turned to me and said, "I'm 96, I know all about aging." So just quickly going back to the overall themes of the presentation, providing personalised care is difficult during communal activities, which are part of a structured routine. We observed longer wait times and less choice available for more dependent residents during communal activities, which also is not uncommon in past literature. We saw that during this, residents were more attuned to these differences than perhaps staff realised. It seems that the more flexible approach, as seen in the Dutch site, allowed for more personalised meal times, even in a group setting. However, we also have to take on board how this could impact staff and what provisions we need to change to make this possible. The aesthetics of the newly purposefully designed Dutch site were very well received within residents, and also in previous literature, there's been a lot of information about how aesthetics can change behaviours and impact quality of life for residents, particularly residents living with cognitive decline or dementia. Finally, I have to stress the importance of giving residents a voice in research. With the methodology we used, we were able to sit and fully immerse ourselves in the lives of residents, sitting watching a film or taking part in activities, for example. So we were really able to understand how the resident felt and their emotions and reactions in real time, rather than trying to ask them to recall information after the fact. And this was really important for the information we gathered. I'd like to briefly go over some implications of the research for practice and research. Firstly, and most importantly, research and practice must work together. It should work together simultaneously to get the best outcome for everybody involved. Methodologically, rapid ethnography engages all stakeholders on a way that we can get much more in-depth information, and this is really important during research to make sure we understand what's going on, but also during practice when we're putting together tasks for staff or activity groups, for example, to make sure we're doing the best possible thing. Contextualizing information across countries shows us where gaps are and how things could be, and gives us the information and the tools to share knowledge to make sure we can do this. And finally, making things person-centered, not only for residents, but for staff and for researchers. We all need to take a person-centered approach to fully make sure that we put information forward properly and implement it in the right way. So to conclude, there's been a lot of progression in the use of person-centered care in long-term residential care in recent decades. However, to successfully implement person-centered care remains an open and ongoing discussion in both research and in practice. The empirical data used in this thesis demonstrated that opportunities for person-centered care were easily missed in sites that had more organisational restrictions, such as low staff numbers or rigid routines. Context must be considered, but also needs to take into account the care environment as well as the physical environment. I'd like to end with a quote from my propositions. It's my final quote. and it's in no way meant to diminish the written word. What it is meant to do is make sure we remember to keep the voices of the populations that we are representing as researchers at the forefront, and make sure we understand how we are presenting information. It's up to the researchers to be person-centered at the forefront. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for your time and for attending today.
Exactly 15 minutes. Thank you very much. We now start with the opposition, and the first opponent is Professor Scholz. He is Professor of Old Age Medicine here at Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, thank you, co-rector. Yes, I have put already switched on. My compliments for your scientific work, and of course also my compliments for your supervising team. Your thesis is about a very meaningful and in the meantime also very actual topics, person-centered care and quality of life of long-term care residents, and how can person-centered care contribute to quality of life in a future-proof and sustainable system of long-term elderly care. But not only compliments, I have also questions. I will start with chapter 2. I've read with great interest this chapter in which you conducted a meta-ethnography. I'll come back to that later. But when I ultimately looked to the included articles and to the partners of the Transsenior network, in fact, I was completely surprised that there was no literature included in the review from Switzerland and the Netherlands. Was you surprised about that as well?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. Honestly, not so much a surprise, because we did specifically go for English language, which I know doesn't rule out Switzerland or the Netherlands in terms of papers. However, it obviously narrows it down in terms of language quality. But yeah, actually, with the Netherlands specifically, with the green care farms and how much person-centered care has come forward, and the quality of life that comes from the green care farms and every initiative that's been put forward by the Netherlands, yeah, I would expect that there would have been more crossover, but it didn't work out with the inclusion.
You do not mean that the quality of literature from the Netherlands is not high enough?
I would say definitely not,
okay.
From my study.
Thank you, but this was only an initial question. I go further with chapter 4. I love eating and drinking. It's one of the most important aspects in life. Not horse amounts, but mice amounts. But you used the approach of a rapid ethnography. And I always follow my lifetime learning goals. And first, can you explain me shortly whether there is also a slow rapid ethnography?
There is, yes. There's the original methodology of ethnography is purely ethnography. A rapid ethnography was developed as a way, particularly in healthcare research, to continue to get the immersive experience of the ethnography and the quality of data that comes with the immersion of a full ethnography, but in a more condensed time frame. So it was more realistic to be able to make changes and active changes within healthcare parameters.
Okay, thank you very much. I have possibility to ask Jan? I will ask one last question because of the many other opponents. You know that malnutrition is a common problem in care homes. Mm-hmm. I know it because we work together with researchers in England also about that, and in Switzerland. But what I saw in your chapter is that the success of person-centered dining experience is primarily measured by how much choice residents have, and not only in the food offered, but also related to the ambience. You showed nice pictures. But I wondered, as a doctor, should person-centered dining not also lead to a reduction of malnutrition, so to an improvement of nutritional status? And shouldn't that be also relevant outcomes of person-centered care?
This is a very interesting question for me, coming from the UK, because in the UK case study, and in the UK in general, it's a much more focused on topic and outcome of meal times, is diminishing malnutrition and making sure people weigh a certain amount and making sure they're getting all the right nutrients, to the point where in the UK case, they were actually coming round with protein shots between meals for people who were considered underweight. The issue is, it doesn't involve any discussion with the resident. So you're offering the choice of, would you like this meal or this meal? If they don't like it, they don't eat it. There's no then pre-discussion of maybe we need to change the meals. There's really a focus on, okay, we just need to boost the nutrients.
But I can indicate you to research done by Wageningen University in which they look to the effect of mealtime ambience on appetite, and they really showed a huge increase of appetite and also an increase in weight loss, of an increase in the in weight gain. Sorry. So.
Yeah, and that's again it's a very interesting concept, but ambience, especially if you look at it in a person-centered way, it's very challenging in a communal setting to say, okay, this person would struggle with this ambience but would thrive in this ambience, but this person is the opposite, but they eat at the same table in the same communal area, and we need to negotiate with both needs and preferences of those two residents who are completely counter opponents. So it's with person-centeredness, that is the challenge, is really how to make it person-centered but in a group.
Okay, thank you very much. I give the word back to the...
Thank you. Now we go to Australia, to Melbourne, to Professor David Edwardson, and he is a professor of nursing. Professor Edwardson, the floor is yours.
Dear highly learned committee colleagues, dear candidate and auditorium, thank you so much for the opportunity to review and to critique this important thesis. I have one overall question. The goal of the thesis, and it relates to the central concepts of the thesis as expressed in the goal of exploring resident experiences of person-centered care and how person-centered care could impact quality of life. This is then expressed, as the candidate showed in her presentation, in 3 themes: personalizing care within routines, optimizing resident environments, and giving residents a voice. So firstly, I would like the candidate, if you can tell me how the resident experiences of person-centered care comes across in your overall themes and findings, please.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Yeah, this is an interesting one because we don't directly, of course, ask residents, is this person-centered for you? And it's not direct line of questioning. So we really worked to create observation guides and interview guides, and the observation guides also structured the informal conversations that we followed while in the care home. And these were led by the meta-ethnography that we did previously that showed the interlinking factors between resident quality of life and person-centered care. So in doing that, we could have informal conversations which helped us to understand what was going on in the care home that would help or indeed create missed opportunities for person-centered care for residents. So the 3 themes that I outlined specifically, the most important one for me with residents for person-centered care was giving residents a voice. If you don't have that pre-discussion, if you don't have shared decision-making, if residents are not involved in any way, which we saw massively during COVID, that they were not involved in decisions, they were not informed of decisions. If you ask them after the fact, what would you have done in this situation? They chose seeing loved ones taking risks over staying safe. If they'd have been involved, that would have already been more person-centered because it would have focused on the needs, preferences, and wishes of the resident, which is in line with person-centered care.
Thank you. And a follow-up question, would you agree with the statement that the 3 themes are more expressed with the staff voice than the resident voice? Personalizing care, optimizing resident environments, and giving residents a voice?
No.
I'm curious about the agency in the thematic description.
Yeah, no, I think previously, if you look at previous literature, yes, it's come very much from staff voices, and I think that's really what we wanted to work from and build on, and that's why it was really important to have resident voices in the forefront. And while we took on board all three voices of resident staff and family members. For my thesis, it was really a focus on resident voices, and this was really key. And all of those themes came up again. A resident didn't sit and say to me, for my life to be better, they should personalize my care within a routine. It wasn't so specific as that. But you could see in day-to-day life, every conversation you had, the small complaints, the small issues, or the praise that was given by residents to what was going on in the care home, what they said to make them feel more at home and made them feel settled after a transition into long-term care, it all stemmed into these themes.
Okay, thank you. And maybe a short response to the final question around the concepts of person-centered care, person-centered practice, person-centeredness, and person-centered care approach. These all appear in the description. Are they interchangeable?
Yes and no. One leads to one, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is the same one. So person-centered practice takes on board the concept of person-centered care, for example, but you need person-centered care to provide person-centered practice. But if you're providing person-centered practice, you're not altogether taking on all of the concept of person-centered care. So they're interchangeable, but they're interconnected, but not interchangeable, I would say.
Thank you. That's a good response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now continue with Professor Köpke from the University of Cologne, and he is a professor in klinische Pflege.
Thank you, dear candidates. Congratulations to your work, which I read with pleasure, and I also, of course, have some opposing questions. So, starting with the aspect of transition. At different points in your thesis, in your work, transition seemed to be an important aspect. So I wondered why this was not really reflected in the results. So and maybe asking a concrete question. If you look at moments of transition, for example, residents newly admitted to nursing homes, or maybe even going back home from the nursing home. So, are your results? Can you really make a connection to this specific situation from what you gathered in your work?
So, if I may, I'll give. It's kind of a split response, I would say. On the one hand, we went into the long-term residential care homes in really an extreme time where COVID was taking place. So we couldn't actually see the standard practice of someone moving from their home into the long-term residential care home. So while we could make assumptions of how different it was during the time of COVID and how it felt for them, we couldn't accurately represent in real time what it felt like on a day-to-day basis in normal terms, how to move from home into the long-term residential care home. We could only hear that from what staff said were normal procedures. And of course, we were trying to put the resident voices at the front. However, in all of the discussions and in the results and the discussions of my thesis, while we don't directly say this would improve a transition or this is specifically to do with a transition, each movement, each moment, as the person enters the care home, and every conversation we had with a resident living in that care home attributes to a transition in care and this post-transitional phase, which starts from the moment that they walk through the door to the care home, but also carries on day to day as the time goes on in the care home, right up until the point where they're no longer at that care home. Because every single day, something changes within the environment, whether it's residents moving in or residents departing for whatever reason, new staff coming in, changes to the environment, everything changes, and changes to health conditions as well. Everything changes day to day, so this transition really does continue all the way through to the final point of life.
Okay, thank you. So you're saying that it's transition all the time, and it's not a specific situation when people move in because this is resembled by what they experience 1 week later. Okay, but I thought there was something special about really moving in, but yeah, I get your point. And maybe 2 short questions. One is, I really appreciate you saying giving residents a voice. I wondered, with your methodology, looking at 3 nursing homes in 3 countries, probably specific nursing homes, would have been better to give more residents a voice and then come to maybe more generalizable results?
Just to follow up, do you mean by including more long-term residential care homes or more residents within the care homes we...
No, probably more care homes.
Yeah. If we were aiming to generalize the results, I would absolutely agree with you. However, what we were trying to do was really go in depth with the voices that we were hearing and have that full immersive experience. And there was the potential that if we tried to include more, then we would lose some of those voices in the numbers. And we were really going for the qualitative of the information.
Okay, fair point. So one very short question, also maybe go into generalizability. I'm from Germany, and I wondered if I look at these 3 countries and compare it to Germany, there's quite a lot of differences there, I guess. So I wondered, can you say something about transferability to other, maybe less advanced healthcare systems, which I would say Germany is one of?
Yes, thank you. I believe that all information in research is transferable to an extent. The difference in how to implement the information that you learn is the context in the situation you're in. Like you say, Germany is very different. We had 3 actually quite unique countries in the way that they're set up. Like the UK and the Netherlands were so different. If you look, as an example, even at the staffing and the differences in staffing, in the Dutch site, nursing assistants are required to have 3 years of training to be able to have a nursing assistant job, whereas in the UK, they're provided a matter of weeks for training. And so just that difference alone shows how much you have to consider the local context and the knowledge and the experience on the site and the resources on site of how you can put things into place. But what you can do is look at how it works. You might not be able to change everything all in one go. I'd love to say that we could put a green care farm on every long-term residential care home spot, but we can't. But what we can do is take small initiatives from each of the place and say, okay, if we just make this one small change here, it will already improve quality of life, it will already improve life for residents. So that's how we need to start transferability. We need to stop seeing it as we take the whole study and we should be able to do it somewhere else. We can take this one piece and start the puzzle here, and that's how we can build on it.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Oudekerk and Schreuder, and she is a professor here in the Maastricht University in the field of customer-centric service.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, and thank you for giving residents a voice. And that's a compliment and an appreciation that I also share with your supervisory team, because I really think it's crucial. I'm delighted to be a member of your assessment committee. It was a great pleasure reading your thesis. And since we never met during your PhD trajectory, I tried to understand who you are. And looking at your background, I think you are extremely well equipped to do this job and give residents a voice. Coming from hospitality, moving to marketing, being a real practicing nurse, working in elderly care, in sports and rehab, it's no surprise that you managed to pull this off. Please allow me also to play a bit the devil's advocate here in your dissertation, and especially I would like to build on chapter 6. As you might recall from your marketing training, and I'm not trained in any care-related disciplines. I have no medical background. I'm from the School of Business and Economics. I have a marketing background, and you might recall that we have something like a service profit chain, which in layman's terms more or less says if you have a happy employee, you have a happy customer, and that's good for the organization. So what you argue in your dissertation is that person-centered care focuses on the resident. How would you consider focusing on the employee instead, focusing on nursing staff? Obviously in chapter 6 you already involved staff, but what if we would say, well, person-centered care is really trying to understand how we enable, facilitate, empower staff, because then, in the end, that will lead to person-centered care, meaning residents in the center. And so I would really like your reflection on this flipping the coin type of exercise.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I completely agree with you. I could not agree more. I believe, yes, I believe the resident should be at the forefront. I believe in shared decision making, and I believe in the resident voice being key since it is their home. However, to support that and to support person-centered care, we also need to support staff. And in doing that, we actually need to look at them in the same way and provide person-centered training. So this means, for example, going back to the context situation, and the staff training and the differences in staff training per site, if we take the example of the Dutch site and the UK site, the difference in training there would need to be quite large in terms of the background knowledge, the background experience, the length of time the person's been training for the role. And that's what we need to do. We need to look at each staff member as an individual and look, and I understand this is challenging because you have a large staff force, but if you look at each staff member's experience, their background, their current training, what they need, how they need to be trained, and how we can help with their perceptions of what's needed and their confidence, and really put this all into play in one go, then person-centered care for the resident would have a much better chance as well. So the person-centeredness needs to go to each person, and I struggle a little bit with the term person-centered care, because I really feel like it should be person-centeredness, because it should be for each person.
Yeah, thank you very much for your elaboration. I think we are thinking in a similar way in that sense. And in addition to my role here at university, I'm also one of the supervisory board members at Meander, and I think I recognized one of the pictures with the PADS facility. And if I would take the findings of your dissertation now to Meander, which is a Dutch regional facility for elderly care, what would be the one top priority advice that I should bring to the elderly care homes if we listen to the findings of your study?
That is a very good question. And first, I won't confirm or deny where the picture came from, just for anonymity. Okay. However, from the time spent with residents, particularly in the site we were at, and from their voices, from their concerns, from their questions over what was happening, the building aesthetics and how the building was designed is wonderful. Mm-hmm. It really is. Compared to what you see in a lot of other sites, it was very innovative. There were animals around, there were opportunities for residents to be very independent and do their own thing. But residents weren't involved in any of that. And even still, some of the corridors, for example, were somewhat maze-like, which I found challenging at times, or the automatic doors didn't quite work properly. Small things like that, they weren't tested with residents in mind. They were tested as, this is a great innovation, and residents will love it. And residents did love it once they got on board with it, but it was still disruptive to their daily life when they'd just moved into that new site from a more traditional site that they were in before. So yeah, I think in all design purposes, the meal times were working really well actually in the Netherlands, but design, routines, everything, just the residents should be involved right from square one of any point of long-term residential care. It's their home.
I can relate very well to that. So we give residents a voice, and then we'll make steps forward. Thank you so much for your reflection.
Okay. Now we go to Switzerland again, to Basel. Dr. Oliver Mautner, the floor is yours. Oh, sorry. I didn't unmute my microphone. We go now to Basel, to Dr. Oliver Mautner. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear committee, dear candidate. Thank you very much for the opportunity to read and review this work, which I'm very much enjoyed. So, dear candidate, I have a question for you, because in your work, you write that your work, that political, legal, or economic and cultural context and values shape very much the way patient-centered care can be implemented and practiced in long-term residency care homes. So, in your opinion, what do you think needs to be addressed urgently? First, on a societal level, and then maybe more particularly on a local level, considering current circumstances, that patient-centered care can be implemented.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. This is not an easy one, I will say. I think firstly, I will say that there are challenges in all federations, all governments, all contexts towards presenting person-centered care and in how to allocate care. In some places it is working slightly better, but it is a challenge across the board. I think really when we look at it, firstly, and if I'm going to go out to the bigger level first of the politics and how this gets decided, I think one of our biggest issues, personally, is that the decisions are being made without fully consulting, and it's not even just residents at this point, without consulting care homes. And this was really, this was highlighted during COVID in a lot of different contexts where care homes were not brought into the decision-making process. They were not involved in how things should be functioning better. And this is a day-to-day occurrence. It's not just with COVID, even though the media like to just blame COVID for this situation. This is really day-to-day, and it shone a spotlight on this issue that we have. That decisions are being made by people who do not understand the context, do not understand the needs of residents, of staff. There needs to be more involvement from all voices before we can say this is how it should be done. And I think that's really a problem. And on a more local level, I would actually like to give an example from some of my results from a local level, and again, just referring back to COVID, with the differences of how it can be done well and how it can be really cause a negative impact on the long-term care home itself. In Switzerland, what we saw were local governments, federal governments were giving long-term residential care homes the responsibility to make the decisions about how they were functioning during COVID. So they were given guidance, but they weren't laws. So they had some freedom within the guidance of how to run within the long-term residential care home. The negative side of that is that staff were, especially management, really felt the burden of this. So there is a question of how much responsibility to give to staff before we put too much emphasis on them and potentially blame on them if it works out in a negative way. But what we saw was the care home opened more quickly. The staff were supported in a much better way, had much more communication, and were able to voice their concerns within the care home. And then if you look at the flip side of the really polar opposite of that in the UK site had no say in what they were doing. In the UK in general, the government made laws, and because they were worried about vulnerable populations, they really just went full lockdown. So some of the residents didn't see their relatives for a solid year. And it's not just residents that felt that, staff did as well, because they were also locked down within that year. They had the same responsibilities and the same burdens, but the difference between the staff in Switzerland and the staff in the UK was that staff in Switzerland could discuss this and have meetings and say, this isn't working for us, we're struggling, how can we change this? But in the UK, they said, we're struggling, this isn't working for us, how can we change this? And the answer was, you don't get to say, you do as you're told. And so that's, yeah, on a local level, really, there needs to be, again, more voices and more decisions made in-house.
What you're saying really resonates with me. So I can, of course, I very much understand the Basel, the Swiss context, because we lived through it. And as someone who is managing a hospital as a chief nursing officer, we've really lived through this. And I can, like, as I said, it really resonates with me. If I may ask one more question, I was also really intrigued with your concept of giving residents a voice. I think it's a very important concept that we see throughout research also with other vulnerable populations, but including very vulnerable long-term care residents with cognitive impairment in your research. I would assume that conducting interviews, getting them involved to answer open-ended questions, asking them for written informed consent, that must have been challenging at times, I would assume. So when you reflect upon this process of including this population, what would you say was very helpful in including them and getting the data? And what would you do differently the next time when you include a population like this?
I think it's a difficult one for me because there are so many people say vulnerable population and how to involve people and reflecting on my time, especially with the residents who are living with dementia. And again, I'd like to go to an example from one of the interviews that I did, and this was in the UK case study. And it was a gentleman who had dementia, had lucid days, had less lucid days, had previously been a GP and understood himself to be living in the care home because it was his GP office and because he was actually there helping the other residents and taking care of them. From the methodology that we used, I could sit with him day to day, so I could understand firstly these lucid and less lucid moments. But I was also able to live in his world. And this was really, really special for me because it's not just asking about who someone was 10 years prior to them having dementia and changing throughout the progression of it. This was living in the dementia with this gentleman and understanding his voice and his view in that moment in time. And from his answers to questions, I didn't change the questions in terms of I still wanted to understand how his quality of life was, how he was sleeping. But what the open questions meant was that I could ask him questions like, oh, when you're on call here, because the bed he thought was his on-call bed, when you're on call, do you manage to get much sleep, or does anything keep you awake at night? And he was able to say, well, you know, there are always bells going off, so I always have to react to that. Or this resident really always comes into my bedroom, and that's really a challenge to sleep through. And he was really talking about it from a GP's perspective as if it was his office and that he was going to go home. But I could still understand what was disruptive for him, what worked for him, what didn't, what was challenging for him around the care home and how it could still be made a little bit better. And I think that was, for me, it was a really special time being able to live in that world for a minute.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. We now continue with Professor Van Achtenberg. He is a professor of quality of care at the University of Leuven.
Okay, dear candidate, dear Megan, my congratulations on all your hard work and the book you presented and have written so far. Also, congratulations on being the first of the Transenior Consortium, the group of PhD students, the first one to defend the thesis, right, today. But of course, time's running out, so quickly to some questions, and they have to be a bit difficult and challenging. I'm going to focus on your mealtime study, and I'm going to focus on what I did not read in your thesis. Okay. And the first one is your argumentation for the choice of mealtimes. There's many relevant issues, events during a day in a nursing home. Why mealtimes?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. The choice of mealtimes actually came about because even within the first case study, in so many of the interviews and informal conversations, mealtimes came up time and time again, whether prompted or not by residents. It was really, if you said, how's your day been so far today? Oh, the lunch wasn't up to much. It was always at the tip of everyone's tongue was about meals and drinks and whether they'd had enough to eat or whether they were hungry or whether the food was not so good. And then on the flip side of that, where there were routines in place, some in more of the long-term residential care homes than others, they typically always centered around mealtimes. So mealtimes was the one part of the routine that never changed in certain care homes, where it was really meals are served from 8 till 9. Prior to that are care routines, after that are activities, then meals are served from 12 till 2. After that we have activities or we do this. So it really was central to life in long-term residential care, and with person-centered care being such a broad topic, at some point we had to narrow it down to really be able to explore person-centered care on a deeper level. So,
so
with
basically
that being
you're
so,
saying it emerged from my talks to people, right?
Yeah, it came from the
everybody
people.
Talks about. Okay, yeah. The other thing I wondered about is your sample, because you say I created a sample with variation in age and ethnicity, I think, and what else? Social network, gender. But I wondered about how long were they in the nursing home? Because I think, well, it makes a difference. Are you totally adjusted? Are you there for 2 years or for 2 weeks? But also cognition, because of course it's also very relevant in a nursing home. What about variation for those two characteristics?
For the characteristics, of transition or of
time since transition and cognition. Can you say anything? Well, you didn't choose to create variation for that, apparently.
No.
But can you say anything about what your group was?
Yes.
In relation to those two things?
Yeah, so we actually did have a really nice range. When we were discussing with care home management about who might be willing to be participants or who they'd spoken to primarily to be involved in the study, we did stipulate that we wanted to hear from residents who had just moved in and who had been there for some time, so that we could get a range of experience, because of course, even while I say the post-transitional phase continues throughout, that first day is really important to capture if you can. And we were actually really fortunate that in all 3 case studies, we were able to see people moving in, sometimes in extreme circumstances, and they went straight into quarantine when it was during COVID times, sometimes not. So we were able to get a good range from that end, but also residents that had been there for 6, 7 years and able to get their perspective. And on the level of cognition, we also said we didn't want to say everyone needs to have a certain dementia score or not. We wanted to make sure we were inclusive of all voices that were representing the long-term residential care home. So it really depended on who was there at the time and who to speak to, not us saying we want this population or this population. It was to make sure we're representative of of all of the voices. And we actually were fortunate that there was a range in cognition in each of the care homes in terms of level of dementia or cognitive decline, or some people who literally were moving in because they couldn't remain at home because they couldn't feed themselves anymore, but were fully cognitive.
Okay, then I'm reassured, and I'll quickly move on to question number 3 about this chapter, because that's an important one, I think. I thought when I read it that for the most part the focus is on the care that is provided, the care that is given to people, the care that they received, that they experienced, and there's not so much focus on the person, in the sense, like, what does the person do to engage in person-centered? Does the person take action, express preferences, take it into your own hands, for instance? Or And I read little about it. Didn't it happen, or was it not the focus, or?
Honestly, it wasn't a specific focus of the thesis to write that down, but if I may reflect on my time and what I observed in the care homes, just to jump back, what we saw was it differed. How much a resident was involved in their care differed depending on which of the sites we were at. So, for example, in the UK, where there are more, it's not that there are more health and safety restrictions, but staff are more responsive to the health and safety restrictions put in place. Residents were given slightly less independence where staff were informed they had to help a resident, they helped a resident. So if a staff member was told this resident is not fully mobile and should not stand up on their own, they did not stand up on their own. Whereas what I observed in the Dutch site was it was the opposite of that. They really said, okay, well, let's see what happens here. And yes, okay, we've said that they need assistance with standing, but if they want to try and stand on their own, let's not quickly put an alarm mat underneath them just so we can get there in time. Let's see if they can stand on their own and we'll help them when they need the help. And in Switzerland, it was more similar to the Dutch site.
But that doesn't really answer my question yet. Did you see many examples of people taking the lead, is what I mean, right? Like, this is what I want to stand up, regardless of what you tell me. I missed that kind of result. Maybe it wasn't there, or maybe it was, you were more focused on what did people get as consumers of care.
I think we were more focused on opportunities taken and missed in person-centeredness. But yes, there certainly was, especially verbally, residents were very involved in what they wanted. But again, depending on the site, it didn't always mean that they got what they wanted, because if those health and safety requirements had been really drilled into staff that you must do this, it actually became detrimental to the resident, because while they were vocalizing saying, I don't want you to do this, I don't want you to do this, it either meant that staff eventually had to say they don't want to be washed today, they don't want to have this happen today, so they just wrote it down, resident declined, which meant that they didn't get the care, or the resident was branded as difficult within the environment, which again then follows them throughout the time in the long-term residential care home and can become really detrimental to the care provided.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I need to give the word back to the chair.
Okay, all opponents so far had in common that they were a member of the assessment committee. The final opponent, the last opponent, was no member of the assessment committee. Professor Jan Hamers from University of Maastricht, professor of care of older people.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidates, I would like to endorse the compliments of the previous opponents regarding your thesis, and especially knowing the complexity of doing, well, international studies in Europe and the COVID pandemic, of course. Congratulations go also to your supervisory team, and especially to the first supervisor, because I think this defense is a rather special occasion also for her. I have 5 different questions, so with the eye and the time, I do not know which one to ask. So please help me, give me a number between 1 and 5.
Well, 3 is the magic number.
3,
so.
Okay. Oh my gosh, that's the most difficult one on my list. No, I'm joking, I'm teasing you a little bit. I would like to invite one of the power nymphs to read proposition number 7.
Sorry. To successfully inform change, health science needs to be open to new methodologies which facilitate more in-depth data collection.
So, when I was reading your thesis, and I saw, especially looking at the methodology you have used, ethnography, and especially most of the cases, the rapid ethnography, I was really wondering, what type of new methodologies are you proposing? Could you reflect on that?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Honestly, what I was meaning by that was more use of techniques such as rapid ethnography, which is relatively newly developed and is still somewhat, I would say, criticized, especially by pure ethnographers who believe that if you reduce the time frame in ethnography, you reduce the quality, and therefore you don't produce the right results in the same way that you would with a full ethnography. But I would argue that if you have a good level of familiarization, if you have especially sites where trust has already been built in past research, you can certainly gain the same amount of knowledge from a full immersion, which we saw from being really immersed for a short period of time, but we saw everyday life from every day of the week, from every time of day, including night shifts. So we were able to really immerse ourselves, and I think that's what I mean when there needs to be more open-mindedness. It's not to say, oh, well, it's qualitative, but it's too short to be qualitative. I think it's very narrow-minded to say you need to stop doing this because it's just not exactly how we would do it.
Mm-hmm. By the way, I was wondering, I can imagine why the rapid ethnography is criticized by authors like Janice Morse, who said, well, are we forgetting the idea of ethnography in itself? It's about the time.
Megan Davies, the time appointed for your defending your thesis and has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense, and I request you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room. Thank you.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. down the line. I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
so embarrassed by how bad the presentation was. No, I don't ever want to watch that. I lived it. It's bad enough.
I was the
terrible.
whole time.
It was
in
so
my head.
bad. I couldn't even read the notes.
But the thing was, like, it wasn't that bad, but you were shaking your head, and I was like, "Come on, you're doing amazing."
It was so bad.
No, you were just really nervous. That's why. What are you doing?
All right.
Stop crying. You're always crying. I've never seen a day where you weren't crying. Do you know that if she laughs and she starts crying?
Oh, that happens to me.
Always.
Not
Always.
instantly, but it happens.
There hasn't been a day.
At least it's happy tears.
Not always. It's not only with me, it's every time you enter our room and there's 5 of us.
Are we not back?
Yeah. We're back.
I can hear the stick.
Now your part's over. I think you have to swear something.
Yeah, but you have to just repeat.
Opponent as well. Just one. I know. And I realised when I then turned to the next one, I was like,
Oh no.
I'm going to apologise afterwards.
I think you have to swear that you will perform good research or something. But then you have to repeat after Hilde.
Okay.
And then you have to do like...
Yeah. So I just follow everything she did.
Megan Davies. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Verbeek is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite now your supervisor to take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee hereby present, I hereby confirm upon you, Megan Davies, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university. Dear Dr. Davies, dear Megan, it is with great honor that I'm the first person to congratulate you in person with your new PhD title. This is a special PhD, as it is a joint degree between 2 universities, Maastricht University and Basel University in Switzerland. It's a well-deserved title, as you have done an amazing work in long-term care, especially for our under-recognized group, residents living with dementia in care homes, and that in 3 countries, also including your home country, the United Kingdom. It is a milestone, not just for you, but also for the Transenior Consortium as a whole, as was already referred to by Professor van Achterberg. You are the first one to have finished the Marie Curie doctoral program of Transenior Training Network, of the 13 early stage researchers in total, of many of them who are present here on site or online. Your thesis was approved by the assessment committee within 4 years' time, and that in itself is a huge accomplishment, which is not that common. And also for me personally, as also was referred, it's a milestone. As well, as you are my first PhD student, I have handed over the PhD degree and allowed to give the laudatio in my new position as full professor. So thank you. I remember our first meeting very well. It was in Leuven, Belgium, at the Transenior recruitment event. At this event, we have invited candidates from over 100 applications for a job interview of all 13 projects at once. This was a new experience, not only for the people coming, but also for us. As you've heard today, the Transenior Network is a doctoral program funded by the European Union. And what makes the program unique is that it is a partnership of universities, research institutions and infrastructures, and other socio-economic actors like long-term care organizations, Meander Groep, Cura Viva, but also NGOs and the World Health Organization from different countries across Europe and beyond. The goal of this specific doctoral program is to respond to well-identified needs in various research and innovation areas. Research training as well as transferable skills and competencies are trained for you, and also focusing on innovation and long-term employability of those graduating. In Transenior, we aim to train healthcare innovators for the future of long-term care for senior citizens. And I think you allow on all part of that. So thank you and congratulations. It's a multidisciplinary team in which you have worked with people with backgrounds in geriatrics, nursing science, psychology, health policy, economics, gerontology, to name a few. And the consortium consists of 7 universities in 7 countries and of 14 partners in total, like Age Platform Europe and the WHO. So you can imagine this is a very complex system in which our PhD candidates were selected for. And it was a 2-day event, and applicants had to do interviews and some tests, for example, to select on based on their methodological skills. You have told that you have said to nobody that you were attending that and trying for it. And from all people I've seen that day, you stood out. With your background and career in marketing, you made the step towards healthcare. You worked as a nurse in a hospital care, specifically on a ward for old people's medicine. And you did your master's program in more applied science and exercise. In the interview, I remember your enthusiasm and your professional. You were really an enthusiastic professional, spoke very eloquently, and with an enormous ambition and passion. And we thought that's the person who can engage in all these forces putting on you for the project. But above all, with a heart for care for older persons in particular. You are the perfect one for the program. It was 2019 and you started with your main position at the University of Basel and in Maastricht University where you will do your secondments. And I think it really takes courage to enter a program like Transenior, and it's your credit that you're here now, taking the degree. You went living abroad, moving from the UK to Switzerland, and I think it was really great that your brother lived there, so you had your family with you. And furthermore, a very important person, Buddy, the cat, went living with you as well. And he was during you all that time and a frequent visitor of our Zoom calls where we also had the chance to see him. Doing your joint degree, being involved in a program with 2 different universities has managed challenges which you have faced. The different cultures of doing a PhD at each university, different requirements, different legal aspects from 2 universities and 2 degrees on how to obtain a PhD, but also a whole team of supervisors with each their own view on how the project should be. and try to manage that. I think you've done an amazing job in that. You had to do secondments in the Netherlands, but also at a non-academic institution. And it was next to your doing scientific and empirical work, the case studies. Exploring a new methodology was not only new to you, to some of the supervisors, and also relatively new in the field. Participating in transsenior network events where all PhD students were trained and exchanged information, where you had your training and presented your work to colleagues. These events were organized in all partner countries. And then hit COVID-19. The world 1 year after you have started, and the world shut down. Care homes shut down, and they were hit the hardest of society, and were in lockdown for a long time. Everybody was expected to work from home, and there you were, alone at home in your room. Traveling to other countries, which was planned and intended, was not allowed. All events were online. Your secondment in Maastricht was much more virtual than anticipated, and you worried, obviously, for family back home. How was there? And you couldn't visit them. And we had to be careful not all to turn into zombies, because we were Zooming much more in Zoom events and transsenior events than previously anticipated on. So it was a difficult time, especially because your project relied so heavily on ethnographic work in the field where you participate in everyday life in care homes together with resident staff and their families. We had to adjust our plans continuously, adapting to the local measures and regulations and then changing again and again and again. Luckily, in the end, you were able to come and visit care homes as well in the Netherlands, and as well meet your colleagues at the Department of Health Services Research. It's due to your hard work, your persistence, and your good relationships with the field of care homes, with staff, and with everybody present, that you pulled it off. And I think it might have to do with one of your biggest hobbies, that is running. In running, you take one step at a time. I hate running. It makes me way too tired, but you love it. It gives you strength, it gives you energies, and I think it helps also in finishing the thesis. Your heart is really burning for residents in long-term care and how to give them a voice. This theme accompanied you throughout the PhD thesis. And right from the start in the beginning, you start working part-time with our partner organization, Cura Viva in Switzerland. That's an organization of nursing homes. It shows your great passion and interest to make an impact in the daily life of all the people living in care homes. And it allowed you to combine scientific research with the everyday care practice, one of your passions. Furthermore, it was a good opportunity to immerse yourself in a German-speaking environment, which was just not possible at the university where everybody spoke English. This position also allowed you to get in contact with the policy world and have contact, for example, with the Global Aging Network, an international network of leaders in aging services, housing, research, technology, and design. You took the opportunity to write several publications for a wider audience and also contributed to the recently published document, A Call to Governments on Aging and Long-Term Care. At Cura Viva, you felt a warm welcome from the beginning, and I think that's really great. You've made great achievements in the last 4 years, despite all challenges you've presented, your work at conferences, published scientific papers, and have contributed to important reports, for example, on taboos and prejudice in long-term care. Really important work, showing the intersection of scientific research and impact in society. And I had some spies who told me an interesting story about Megan, that one time you received a coffee mug with your very first abstract published on it. And a first abstract is really a big thing if your work, are you able to present your work at a conference. And apparently for a long time you did not know where this came from. You thought, did I order that online in one night? Why is that here? And it turned out it was a ritual in the use at Basel University at the department where you worked for everyone to receive their first abstract in a specific mug, so you will remember it forever. And you were just not aware of it. It's COVID, Zooming. So dear Megan, on behalf of the whole PhD committee consisting of Michael Simon, Franziska Zuniga, Sandra Staudacher, all from Basel University, and myself from Maastricht, I would like to congratulate you with this wonderful achievement and also congratulate your parents, brother, and his girlfriend, friends and family. And I hope you can continue doing your great work. Congratulations.
Thank you. Dear Megan Davies, dear Dr. Davies, it's a great honor to me to congratulate you with this milestone in your career. Really a milestone, I would say. Referring to the academic session this afternoon, I'm not permitted to say anything about what has been said there in this by the evaluating committee. It's forbidden by the university, so let me speak for myself. You did a wonderful job as a neutral chairman, because I'm not a specialist in your field. I very much appreciated your answers to the questions. You either qualified as interesting or difficult or complex. Never easy, by the way. I would also like to congratulate the supervisory team, the international supervisory team, with this success. And I also would like to thank the opponents for their interesting questions. I have one final comment, and that is referring to your statement number 9, where you say that we can learn from failures, right? My suggestion would be that you can also learn from success, right? We've now come to the end of this official session, but first, before we end it, I would like to give our opponents from all over the world, Australia and Switzerland, to congratulate the new doctor. So the floor is yours, Dr. Where are you? Edvardson. Dr. Mountner?
Dr. Davies, I'm congratulating you as well to your successful PhD defense. Great work. You worked great here in Basel with Viva. That was really important work that you've done here, and all the success for the future and your ongoing work. And I hope to see more of your work. Thank you.
Okay, then we now come to the end of this session, but before we leave this room, we do some photography. So that's it. We are now going to make a photo. Yes?
Yes, and there's a reception for all you over there, right?
Oh, it's here?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Ga nu maar een beetje hier, kom voor me, please.